Europe at the end of the 18th century carried instability not as an emergency but as a condition. The old monarchies still stood, but they did so with a sense of rehearsal rather than conviction, repeating rituals whose authority no longer felt automatic. Revolution had fractured the assumption that power descended naturally through bloodlines, replacing it with uncertainty disguised as principle. Armies moved across borders more frequently than before, yet they still obeyed habits shaped by an earlier century, where campaigns unfolded slowly and outcomes were negotiated as often as they were enforced. Violence existed, but it followed a tempo Europe believed it understood. The continent had not yet adjusted to speed as a governing force, and this miscalculation formed the environment into which Napoleon Bonaparte emerged. France embodied this tension most visibly. The revolution had dismantled hierarchy without fully replacing it, leaving institutions operational but hollowed. Authority survived through committees, decrees, and improvisation, while legitimacy shifted constantly beneath the surface. The army, however, adapted faster than the state it served. Promotions rewarded competence rather than pedigree, and command became conditional on performance rather than birth. These changes were not ideological gestures but necessities imposed by prolonged conflict. France required officers who could endure pressure, calculate risk, and act without hesitation. Within this system, opportunity existed for those willing to submit to discipline rather than tradition, and Napoleon's early career unfolded inside this narrow but decisive opening. Napoleon was shaped by compression. His Corsican origins placed him at the margins of French identity, while his education trained him to respect structure without reverence. Illness and isolation sharpened his inward focus, encouraging observation over display. He absorbed mathematics, fortification, and logistics not as abstractions but as tools for survival. In an army increasingly reliant on coordination and timing, these skills mattered more than lineage. His early assignments did not announce destiny. They tested endurance. Artillery required patience, calculation, and acceptance of delay, qualities that aligned with his temperament. He learned to measure effect rather than seek recognition, a habit that would define his later authority. The political world surrounding him offered no stable path. Alliances shifted quickly, and reputations dissolved faster than they formed. Revolutionary France distrusted ambition yet depended upon it, creating a contradiction navigated daily by those in uniform. Napoleon watched senior officers fall not from incompetence but from misalignment with prevailing factions. Survival demanded neutrality in speech and clarity in action. He learned to separate loyalty to function from loyalty to ideology, understanding that systems endured longer than slogans. This restraint distinguished him from contemporaries who confused conviction with security. Europe beyond France observed these developments with unease but incomplete comprehension. Monarchies recognized the danger of revolutionary armies yet underestimated their adaptability. They expected France to exhaust itself through internal contradiction, assuming chaos would limit its reach. Instead, the French army converted instability into momentum, refining methods that favored concentration of force and rapid decision. Napoleon did not invent this transformation, but he mastered its implications. He recognized that speed altered not only battles but perception. Decisions made quickly forced opponents into reaction, stripping them of initiative and compressing their options. Napoleon's first major commands revealed this dynamic gradually rather than dramatically. In Italy, he encountered armies trained for caution and negotiation, accustomed to seasons rather than urgency. He imposed movement where delay had been expected, coordination where separation had been routine. Soldiers followed because results arrived promptly and visibly. Success did not require rhetoric. It manifested in supply, survival, and momentum. His authority grew not through charisma but through consistency. Each engagement reinforced the sense that he operated within a different temporal framework, one that rewarded decisiveness and punished hesitation. At this stage, Napoleon remained an instrument rather than an architect. He served a government that neither trusted nor fully understood him. Paris valued victories but feared autonomy, monitoring generals closely while demanding results. Napoleon navigated this tension with caution, framing ambition as obedience and innovation as necessity. He communicated efficiency rather than vision, avoiding ideological claims that might provoke suspicion. This discipline allowed him to advance without triggering resistance, embedding himself deeper within structures already straining under pressure. The broader European order began to feel this shift indirectly. Campaigns ended sooner than expected, treaties dissolved quickly, and borders lost permanence. States accustomed to predictability encountered a form of warfare that denied pause. Napoleon's actions did not yet threaten the balance of power directly, but they exposed its fragility. He demonstrated that authority could be generated through performance rather than recognition, unsettling a system built on inherited legitimacy. Europe reacted cautiously, adjusting tactics without reconsidering assumptions. Napoleon himself remained contained by circumstance. He did not yet command loyalty beyond his immediate sphere, nor did he claim political authority. His influence derived from usefulness rather than mandate. This limitation shaped his behavior, encouraging restraint over proclamation. He observed how power accumulated through repetition, how reliability created dependence, and how visible success neutralized skepticism. Each lesson reinforced a preference for control exercised quietly rather than asserted openly. The France Napoleon inhabited required stabilization more than inspiration. Its population desired continuity after years of upheaval, and its institutions sought predictability above ideology. Napoleon absorbed this atmosphere, understanding that endurance mattered more than novelty. He learned to operate within uncertainty without attempting to resolve it prematurely. This patience distinguished him from revolutionaries driven by urgency and reactionaries trapped by nostalgia. By the close of this period, nothing had yet been decided in name, but much had shifted in practice. Europe remained formally intact, and France remained officially unstable, yet a new pattern had begun to assert itself. Napoleon had not announced transformation, but he had demonstrated how quickly systems could be forced to adapt. The continent stood vulnerable not because it lacked strength, but because it underestimated acceleration. In this environment, inevitability did not arrive as declaration. It gathered silently through repetition, precision, and the steady erosion of old expectations. Napoleon's early victories did more than defeat opposing armies. They unsettled assumptions that had governed European warfare for generations. His campaigns did not unfold according to established rhythms of maneuver, encampment, and negotiation. Instead, they advanced with a compression of time that left opponents reacting to outcomes they had not yet processed. In Italy, the terrain itself became an accomplice to speed, narrow valleys channeling movement while scattered enemy forces struggled to coordinate. Marches were longer, pauses shorter, and decisions irreversible once executed. Soldiers felt the strain in their bodies first, the ache of forced pace and shortened rest, but they also felt coherence replacing uncertainty. Orders arrived clearly, objectives aligned with movement, and success followed effort with unusual immediacy. This relationship between exertion and result bound men to their commander more effectively than rhetoric. European observers initially misread these victories as anomalies produced by local weakness rather than systemic change. They underestimated the significance of a commander willing to disregard convention not through recklessness, but through calculation. Napoleon concentrated force where others dispersed it, accepting risk temporarily to secure decisive advantage. He treated speed as a weapon equal to artillery, eroding enemy morale before formal engagement. Diplomats and generals accustomed to measured escalation struggled to respond. Their plans assumed time for adjustment, for councils and correspondence, yet Napoleon's actions collapsed these intervals. Decisions demanded immediacy, and hesitation produced loss. Authority began to accrue around him because continuity of success suggested reliability within chaos. The Egyptian campaign extended this disruption beyond Europe's familiar theaters. It revealed both Napoleon's ambition and the limits of his control. Logistics strained under distance, disease, and unfamiliar climate. Soldiers endured heat, thirst, and isolation, their endurance tested as severely as their loyalty. Yet even here, Napoleon's presence altered perception. He framed setbacks as conditions rather than failures, maintaining discipline through explanation and structure. European powers observed closely, recognizing that even when outcomes disappointed, his command did not disintegrate. This resilience mattered. It suggested a form of authority less dependent on flawless victory than on sustained coherence under pressure. As reports accumulated, European courts recalibrated. Coalitions formed not from shared vision but shared apprehension. Napoleon no longer represented a French interest alone. He embodied acceleration itself, a destabilizing factor capable of collapsing established balances. States that distrusted one another cooperated reluctantly, bound by the necessity of containment rather than ideological alignment. This reactive posture defined the complication of the era. Europe responded to Napoleon's movements rather than shaping its own. Diplomacy became anticipatory, defensive, and increasingly strained as each coalition confronted the reality that coordination moved slower than his armies. Within France, authority consolidated subtly. The government relied on Napoleon's victories to maintain legitimacy, while simultaneously fearing his independence. This tension shaped their interactions. He was granted resources conditionally, praised publicly, and constrained privately. Napoleon navigated this with careful restraint, presenting obedience while preserving autonomy. He communicated results efficiently, emphasizing necessity rather than ambition. Each success reduced skepticism incrementally, creating dependence that outpaced formal authority. Ministers who once debated his assignments now hesitated to oppose his judgment, aware that stability rested increasingly on his effectiveness. Napoleon's internal discipline evolved alongside his external influence. He understood that speed required control, that relentless movement without coherence would dissolve into exhaustion. He monitored supply lines, enforced order, and punished disorder swiftly. His own physical limits reminded him of fragility, reinforcing habits of delegation and structure. Fear remained present, not of defeat alone but of stagnation. He sensed that momentum, once lost, invited scrutiny and resistance. This awareness sharpened his decisions, encouraging calculated risks balanced by preparation. European armies attempted adaptation, revising formations and command structures. Yet institutional inertia slowed implementation. Officers trained under older systems struggled to internalize the implications of compressed warfare. Napoleon exploited these delays, engaging before reforms could mature. His presence forced continuous adjustment, draining resources and attention. Even victories against him felt provisional, lacking permanence because they did not alter underlying dynamics. Europe confronted a commander who transformed each engagement into a referendum on adaptability itself. Public perception shifted accordingly. Napoleon's name circulated independently of office, becoming shorthand for disruption. Soldiers spoke of him as an organizing force, civilians as a source of both fear and order. This duality complicated opposition. To resist him meant resisting outcomes that, however unsettling, delivered clarity in place of uncertainty. Authority gathered around him not because it was imposed, but because it functioned visibly. Success appeared continuous not as triumphal spectacle, but as repeated confirmation that systems aligned around his command produced results. By this stage, Napoleon was no longer merely advancing within existing structures. He was altering the environment through which power moved. European reactions hardened into patterns of response, reinforcing his centrality. Each coalition acknowledged implicitly that his removal was prerequisite to stability. This recognition granted him leverage disproportionate to his formal position. He remained constrained by politics, geography, and chance, yet his influence extended beyond direct control. The complication of this phase lay in the gradual inversion of agency. Europe possessed resources, populations, and traditions vastly exceeding those under Napoleon's command, yet it ceded initiative repeatedly. He dictated tempo, forcing others into accommodation. This did not yet resolve into dominance, but it redefined the contest. Power became measured less by territory than by capacity to compel reaction. Napoleon embodied this shift, his authority consolidating because it answered exhaustion with decisiveness. By the end of this chapter, the transformation remained incomplete. Napoleon had not declared supremacy, nor had Europe surrendered autonomy. Yet strategic expectations had been irreversibly altered. War no longer unfolded at Europe's preferred pace, and diplomacy no longer assumed gradual escalation. Napoleon's rise complicated every calculation, forcing systems built for deliberation to confront acceleration. Authority gathered around him not through proclamation, but through the repeated demonstration that in a destabilized world, momentum itself had become power. With authority secured and legitimacy formalized, Napoleon's wars shifted in character without announcing the change. What had once been framed as defense of revolutionary France or protection of personal position expanded into something more expansive and less easily contained. The scale of conflict widened not through declaration but through accumulation. Armies grew larger, fronts extended farther, and the rhythms of mobilization settled into permanence. Europe adjusted its posture accordingly. Governments no longer assumed war would end with treaties restoring balance. They prepared instead for duration, accepting that disengagement now risked marginalization. The atmosphere across the continent thickened with readiness, as if peace had become an interruption rather than an expectation. Napoleon's system traveled with him, moving alongside columns of infantry and artillery. Administration followed conquest closely, not as afterthought but as instrument. Territories absorbed into his orbit encountered standardized law, restructured taxation, and rationalized governance. These measures imposed order even as they provoked resistance. Roads were surveyed, records compiled, obligations clarified. Violence cleared space, but bureaucracy occupied it. This pairing altered the meaning of expansion. Campaigns no longer sought merely to defeat opposing forces. They aimed to integrate regions into a coherent framework that extended Napoleon's influence beyond the battlefield. Control became procedural, sustained through repetition rather than intimidation alone. Psychologically, escalation emerged from success rather than impulse. Each victory created expectations among allies and subordinates that could not be ignored without eroding authority. Client states depended on protection, generals anticipated opportunity, soldiers expected continuity of purpose. Momentum produced obligation. To stop advancing risked fragmentation, inviting rivals to test resolve and allies to reconsider loyalty. Napoleon recognized this trap. His restraint lay not in halting expansion, but in managing its direction, selecting objectives that reinforced cohesion while postponing reckoning. Escalation thus appeared measured, even cautious, though its cumulative effect was relentless. Europe's response hardened under this pressure. States reorganized themselves around permanent military readiness. Conscription systems expanded, economies reoriented toward supply, and social life adjusted to absence and loss. War ceased to be episodic, breaking instead into cycles of preparation and recovery that blurred into continuity. Civilian populations adapted unevenly. Some benefited from administrative clarity and commercial integration. Others endured requisition, displacement, and attrition. Across regions, endurance replaced enthusiasm. Loyalty attached less to ideals than to survival within the prevailing order. Napoleon's own interior discipline sharpened as stakes rose. He became increasingly attentive to logistics, aware that scale magnified vulnerability. Campaigns demanded precision in timing and supply, leaving little margin for improvisation. He studied maps obsessively, calculating distances and capacities with care that bordered on compulsion. Fatigue accumulated, manifesting in bouts of irritability and isolation, yet his control remained firm. He delegated authority strategically, empowering capable subordinates while retaining oversight through reporting structures that reduced uncertainty. Distance became a tool insulating decision-making from immediate emotion. As conflict expanded, so did resistance. Insurgencies flared where administrative integration collided with local identity. These conflicts differed from conventional warfare, draining resources and testing morale. Napoleon responded with a mix of suppression and accommodation, alternating force with reform. This duality reflected his understanding that escalation required management beyond battle. Violence alone could not secure permanence. It had to be accompanied by structures that promised stability. Where this balance faltered, resistance hardened, exposing the limits of imposed order. Diplomatically, Europe recalibrated again. Coalitions reformed repeatedly, learning from defeat without fully overcoming fragmentation. Coordination improved incrementally, but disparities in commitment persisted. Some states fought for restoration, others for survival within a transformed system. Napoleon exploited these divisions, engaging selectively, isolating adversaries before overwhelming them. His campaigns increasingly resembled operations against networks rather than singular enemies, dismantling alliances by undermining their weakest links. The sensory reality of this escalation pressed heavily on those who bore it. Soldiers marched through familiar landscapes now stripped of novelty, their movements routine yet exhausting. Camps rose and fell with mechanical efficiency, the sounds of preparation blending into background noise. Civilians encountered armies as constant presence, their passage anticipated and endured rather than feared anew. The normalization of conflict altered perception. Shock diminished, replaced by calculation. Communities learned to negotiate, adapt, or retreat, integrating war into daily expectation. Napoleon observed these effects without sentiment. He measured success not by spectacle but by continuity of function. Roads remained open, revenues collected, commands executed. Disruption signaled failure, regardless of victory. This pragmatism distinguished escalation from recklessness. Expansion served to stabilize a system whose legitimacy depended on performance. Each campaign aimed to preempt threats that might fracture coherence, reinforcing dominance through anticipation rather than reaction. Europe mirrored this transformation. Rival states centralized authority, curtailed dissent, and mobilized societies in ways previously resisted. The pressure Napoleon exerted accelerated changes that might otherwise have unfolded gradually. War reshaped governance across borders, embedding militarization into political life. Even opposition to Napoleon adopted his methods, reflecting the depth of his influence. Escalation thus operated symmetrically, transforming adversaries as much as allies. By this stage, war had become structural. It organized economies, justified authority, and defined legitimacy. Napoleon stood at its center not as instigator alone, but as conductor of forces already set in motion. His dominance rested on sustaining momentum without allowing collapse. The escalation did not announce itself through a single decisive act. It accumulated through obligation, adaptation, and exhaustion. Europe adjusted because it had to, and Napoleon advanced because retreat threatened unraveling. The system expanded under its own weight, carrying violence and order together, embedding conflict into the architecture of the continent. At the moment when Napoleon's authority appeared most complete, strain surfaced not as rebellion alone but as friction within the system itself. Control had been achieved through acceleration, coordination, and the promise of order, yet those same qualities imposed demands that could not be reduced indefinitely. The continental system exemplified this tension. Designed to isolate Britain economically, it required uniform compliance across diverse regions whose interests rarely aligned with Paris. Ports that depended on trade adapted quietly, smuggling flourished, and enforcement grew increasingly coercive. What had been framed as strategic necessity became an administrative burden, consuming attention and resources while eroding goodwill. Compliance existed on paper, but practice revealed resistance embedded in daily routine. Spain exposed a deeper fault line. There, Napoleon's assumptions about rational governance collided with identity, faith, and local authority. The decision to impose a new dynasty was executed with administrative confidence, yet it underestimated the emotional texture of legitimacy. Resistance did not coalesce into conventional armies alone. It spread through villages, clergy, and irregular bands who transformed terrain into weapon. Roads became traps, supply lines bled steadily, and occupation required constant presence. The war resisted compression. Speed lost relevance where enemies refused decisive engagement, and discipline proved insufficient against persistence. Spain did not defeat Napoleon militarily, but it altered the balance of effort, forcing the empire to spend more energy maintaining control than expanding it. This drain accumulated quietly. Troops rotated endlessly through hostile territory, their fatigue compounding without resolution. Officers adjusted tactics, but adaptation offered only partial relief. Reports grew longer, detailing ambushes and reprisals, their language increasingly procedural as violence normalized. Napoleon monitored these developments with irritation rather than surprise. He recognized the cost, yet disengagement risked signaling weakness. The empire's logic demanded consistency. To retreat was to invite imitation elsewhere. Thus Spain became a commitment sustained less by expectation of victory than by fear of precedent. The strain intensified as the continental system faltered further east. Russia presented a challenge of scale rather than defiance alone. Its compliance was transactional, shaped by its own economic imperatives and strategic horizon. When enforcement conflicted with survival, allegiance loosened. Napoleon interpreted this as correction rather than warning. His experience favored decisive demonstration over negotiation prolonged. The decision to march east followed the same internal logic that had guided earlier campaigns. Yet the environment differed fundamentally. Distance diluted control. Space absorbed momentum. Geography itself resisted integration. The Russian campaign unfolded with ominous regularity. Armies advanced efficiently at first, their movement rehearsed, supply columns stretched thin but intact. Yet the absence of decisive confrontation unsettled expectations. Villages emptied, fields burned, resources withdrawn ahead of the advancing force. The land denied sustenance without offering battle. Napoleon advanced deeper, compelled by necessity rather than confidence, aware that retreat without engagement would dissolve authority more effectively than defeat. Each step forward narrowed options, binding outcome to endurance. As autumn turned, logistics strained beyond recovery. Horses failed, wagons broke, and schedules collapsed under weather and distance. Soldiers adapted instinctively, scavenging and conserving, yet exhaustion mounted. Silence replaced anticipation. The army's discipline held, but its effectiveness eroded. When battle finally came, it resolved nothing. Moscow offered no surrender, only emptiness and fire. The city's destruction stripped victory of meaning, leaving occupation without leverage. Napoleon waited for negotiation that never arrived, time draining value from every decision. The retreat transformed strain into catastrophe. Cold amplified weakness already present. Movement slowed, cohesion frayed, and survival displaced strategy. Yet even here, collapse was not immediate. Units held together through habit and command, enduring losses that defied calculation. Napoleon remained composed outwardly, issuing orders, preserving form as substance eroded. His restraint prevented total disintegration, but it could not reverse accumulation. The army returned diminished not merely in numbers, but in aura. The system had been exposed to forces it could not discipline into compliance. Europe responded accordingly. Resistance, long cautious, gained confidence. States recalculated, recognizing that Napoleon's reach had limits defined by geography and sustainability. Coalitions formed with renewed purpose, not because of ideological clarity but because opportunity had emerged. The empire did not implode. It adjusted, contracting influence where extension proved untenable. Napoleon adapted tactically, rebuilding forces with remarkable speed, yet the equilibrium had shifted. Resources that once fueled expansion now went toward repair. Psychologically, this moment altered perception. Napoleon's authority, previously associated with inevitability, acquired contingency. His decisions remained decisive, but their outcomes no longer appeared guaranteed. Allies reconsidered dependency, adversaries embraced attrition. The aura of compression faded, replaced by recognition that time could now work against him. The system still functioned, but under stress that revealed its design limits. The continental system weakened further as enforcement slackened. Spain continued to consume attention. Russia's survival demonstrated that refusal could endure. These pressures converged not as singular defeat, but as accumulated vulnerability asserting itself. Napoleon confronted a landscape transformed by his own methods. Europe had adapted to permanent mobilization, and that adaptation now constrained him as much as it threatened his enemies. Speed no longer conferred decisive advantage where opponents accepted loss as cost of survival. The empire fractured subtly. Authority persisted, but flexibility narrowed. Each decision carried greater risk, fewer margins. Napoleon's interior discipline hardened into caution, his calculations more conservative as he weighed endurance against ambition. He still commanded immense resources, but their deployment demanded justification beyond momentum. The system he built had reached its sustainable limits. This turning point was not collapse but revelation. It clarified the conditions under which Napoleon's dominance operated and the boundaries beyond which it strained. Geography, logistics, and resistance emerged not as temporary obstacles, but as structural forces. The empire continued, yet under altered gravity. What followed would test whether adaptation could compensate for exposure, or whether accumulated strain would continue to assert itself, reshaping the balance Napoleon had spent a decade constructing. In the aftermath of the Russian campaign, the balance that had sustained Napoleon's dominance shifted decisively, though not abruptly. Europe did not erupt into chaos or sudden revolt. Instead, coordination replaced caution. States that had once maneuvered independently now aligned with a clarity shaped by fatigue rather than optimism. Years of adaptation had taught them how to survive within Napoleon's system, and Russia revealed how that system could be strained without collapsing immediately. The lesson absorbed was not that Napoleon was weak, but that he was no longer inexhaustible. This distinction altered every calculation that followed. Napoleon moved quickly to rebuild. Conscription deepened, drawing younger and less experienced men into ranks once defined by veterans. Equipment shortages were addressed through accelerated production, uniforms simplified, training compressed. The process was efficient, yet it carried a psychological cost. The Grande Armée had once embodied continuity, its cohesion reinforced by shared memory of victory. Now it relied on rapid replacement, its identity diluted by necessity. Discipline remained, but confidence was thinner, rooted more in command structure than in collective belief. Napoleon sensed this shift even as he pressed forward, aware that speed could still compensate for loss, but only briefly. Coalition forces gathered with unprecedented cooperation. Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Britain aligned their objectives not through shared ideology, but through shared recognition that fragmentation had prolonged conflict. Their coordination was deliberate, cautious, and increasingly effective. They avoided decisive engagement when unfavorable, trading territory for time. Napoleon's opponents had learned his methods by enduring them. They denied him opportunities for compression, forcing him into sustained operations that consumed resources without resolution. The tempo he once dictated now constrained him, as maintaining pressure required effort disproportionate to gain. Battles continued, and Napoleon's tactical brilliance remained evident. He maneuvered skillfully, exploiting terrain, concentrating force where possible, and extracting victories that demonstrated his undiminished command. Yet these victories no longer reset the strategic landscape. They were absorbed by coalition depth, their effects blunted by reserves and coordination. Each engagement demanded more from his forces than it returned. Losses could be replaced numerically, but experience and morale proved less renewable. Success slowed, and with it the system's capacity to stabilize. The administrative strain deepened alongside military pressure. Financing prolonged war stretched fiscal mechanisms already burdened by years of mobilization. Taxation increased, requisition intensified, and compliance grew conditional. Allies reassessed their positions, weighing loyalty against survival. Where Napoleon's authority had once offered protection and order, it now required sacrifice without guarantee. Diplomacy shifted accordingly. Agreements became provisional, hedged against anticipated decline. Loyalty persisted, but it narrowed, tied increasingly to immediate benefit rather than shared future. Napoleon's psychological posture adapted under these conditions. His decision-making remained sharp, but caution edged into calculation. The margin for error had narrowed visibly. Earlier in his career, a misjudgment could be corrected through speed or audacity. Now each mistake carried compounding consequence. Geography constrained movement, coalitions constrained options, and time eroded advantage. Napoleon recognized this implicitly, adjusting strategy toward preservation as much as dominance. Yet preservation itself demanded success, an irony that tightened the bind. The campaigns in Germany exemplified this tension. Maneuvers were executed with precision, yet outcomes failed to produce decisive rupture. Towns changed hands, lines shifted, but coalition cohesion endured. Soldiers marched through familiar landscapes scarred by repeated passage, their movements efficient but weary. The sounds of preparation, drums, commands, wagons, carried less anticipation than routine. War had become habitual, its continuation expected rather than dramatic. This normalization reduced Napoleon's ability to shock or intimidate. His presence still commanded respect, but it no longer disoriented opponents. As defeats accumulated, they did so quietly. There was no singular collapse, only erosion. Each setback weakened confidence incrementally, prompting recalibration among allies and adversaries alike. The aura of inevitability faded, replaced by perception of endurance contest rather than decisive struggle. Coalition leaders accepted losses as investment, confident that time favored coordination over brilliance. Napoleon confronted an adversary no longer intimidated by speed, one prepared to absorb punishment for eventual advantage. The domestic dimension reflected similar strain. France's population, long mobilized, felt the weight of sustained conscription and economic pressure. Support remained, but enthusiasm dulled. The narrative of defense and order lost clarity as campaigns extended without closure. Napoleon's legitimacy, built on success and stability, encountered skepticism as outcomes grew uncertain. He responded by maintaining form, emphasizing continuity and authority, avoiding panic or concession. This restraint preserved control but limited flexibility. A system reliant on momentum struggled to adapt to deceleration. The Battle of Leipzig crystallized these dynamics without resolving them entirely. It was not merely a military defeat but a demonstration of coalition capacity. Multiple armies coordinated effectively, denying Napoleon opportunities for decisive maneuver. The scale overwhelmed compression. When retreat followed, it was orderly but symbolic, signaling that dominance had shifted. The empire's borders contracted, its influence receding not through collapse but through pressure sustained beyond tolerance. Napoleon's authority eroded further as defections increased. Former allies recalculated openly, their decisions framed as necessity rather than betrayal. Loyalty became transactional, contingent on protection Napoleon could no longer guarantee universally. This conditionality exposed the fragility beneath imperial cohesion. The system functioned best under expansion. Contraction revealed its dependencies. Administration strained to maintain coherence across shrinking territory, its efficiency challenged by uncertainty. Psychologically, Napoleon confronted isolation. Trusted marshals remained, but dissent emerged cautiously, expressed through hesitation rather than defiance. Advice grew more conservative, reflecting awareness of narrowed margins. Napoleon listened, weighed options, and chose decisively, yet the choices themselves offered limited leverage. His ability to dictate tempo had been replaced by obligation to respond. Initiative persisted tactically but vanished strategically. The breakdown did not negate Napoleon's achievements. It contextualized them. His system had transformed Europe, forcing states to adapt, mobilize, and coordinate in ways previously unimagined. That transformation now constrained him, as opponents mirrored his methods while avoiding his vulnerabilities. The empire required constant success to sustain legitimacy, and success had slowed to equilibrium. Without decisive resolution, pressure accumulated relentlessly. By the time coalition forces advanced toward France, the outcome remained uncertain in detail but clear in trajectory. Napoleon continued to fight with determination, extracting value from every available resource. Yet the structure he commanded could no longer stabilize itself. Diminished margin for error defined this phase. Where once brilliance compensated for risk, now caution could not eliminate it. The man who had shaped Europe's tempo found himself moving within rhythms he could no longer control, his authority constrained by the very system that had carried him to dominate. The end came without the rupture that had defined so many earlier transitions of power. Napoleon's authority receded under pressure rather than shattering under revolt, and that distinction shaped everything that followed. By the time Allied armies entered France, Europe had learned the cost of uncontrolled collapse. Cities taken were not looted indiscriminately, institutions were preserved where possible, and the language of restoration replaced the language of vengeance. The objective was no longer punishment, but containment. Napoleon himself recognized this shift, understanding that resistance now risked not defeat alone, but dissolution of the state he still believed himself responsible for. The final campaigns inside France carried a different emotional register from earlier wars. The terrain was familiar, the towns marked by memory rather than conquest. Soldiers marched through landscapes that had once celebrated victory and now absorbed retreat quietly. Supplies were scarce, movements constrained, yet discipline endured. Napoleon remained active, present, still calculating, but the rhythm had changed. Each engagement delayed rather than redirected outcome. Tactical successes bought time, not leverage. The army fought with competence and loyalty, but without illusion. Victory no longer promised renewal, only prolongation. Politically, authority thinned rather than collapsed. Ministers continued to function, orders were issued, and administration persisted even as legitimacy narrowed. Napoleon's presence still anchored the system, but increasingly as symbol rather than driver. Allies and adversaries alike anticipated transition, adjusting their behavior accordingly. Negotiations carried an air of inevitability, their tone restrained, procedural. No one sought spectacle. Europe had endured too much acceleration to desire another dramatic rupture. The decision to abdicate emerged from accumulation rather than impulse. Napoleon assessed the situation with clarity shaped by years of command. Continued resistance risked civil fracture and foreign occupation beyond control. Abdication offered a way to separate his fate from France's survival. This calculation was not resignation but responsibility, framed by recognition that power, once withdrawn, could preserve what force no longer could. The act itself was formal, stripped of drama, presented as concession to necessity rather than admission of failure. When Napoleon stepped aside, the reaction was measured. There were no mass celebrations, no immediate reprisals. The Senate moved to legitimize transition, framing continuity as restoration. The Bourbons returned under conditions shaped by compromise, their authority bounded by memory of revolution and empire alike. Europe watched closely, wary of overreach. The lesson of previous decades was clear. Instability invited intervention, and intervention prolonged disorder. Restraint became strategy. Napoleon's removal did not erase his presence. He remained reference point, shaping decisions even in absence. His exile to Elba was calculated to neutralize without martyrdom. Close enough to observe, distant enough to limit influence. The arrangement reflected European priorities. Contain the problem without reigniting it. Napoleon himself adapted to this new condition with characteristic discipline. Observing, reflecting, waiting. Power had withdrawn, but awareness had not. The brief return during the 100 Days confirmed these dynamics rather than overturning them. Napoleon's reappearance exposed the depth of exhaustion across Europe. France responded with ambivalence rather than fervor. Allies with coordination rather than panic. The mechanisms of containment activated smoothly, coalition forces mobilizing with practiced efficiency. The final defeat at Waterloo lacked the transformative weight of earlier battles. It resolved uncertainty rather than redefining order. Afterward, there was no appetite for prolongation. The reaction was swift, decisive, and contained. The second exile was more distant, more final. St. Helena was chosen not for cruelty but for isolation, a place where Napoleon could exist without influence. Europe did not need his destruction. It needed his removal from calculation. His presence elsewhere would have distorted diplomacy indefinitely. In isolation, he became memory rather than factor. This distinction mattered. By allowing him to live, Europe signaled closure without erasure. The dismantling of the empire proceeded carefully. Borders were redrawn with attention to balance, not triumph. States were restored, but not empowered to destabilize the system anew. The Congress of Vienna reflected this philosophy, privileging durability over ideology. Former enemies negotiated with mutual recognition of vulnerability. The aim was not to return to the past, but to prevent acceleration of the future. Napoleon's shadow loomed over every discussion, shaping choices through caution rather than fear. Psychologically, Europe adjusted to absence. The constant presence of a singular destabilizing force had structured reactions for 2 decades. Without it, politics slowed. Decision-making became procedural, consensus-driven. This deceleration was intentional. Speed had become associated with catastrophe. Stability now required patience, coordination, and restraint. The system that emerged valued predictability above brilliance. Napoleon's legacy within this resolution was complex. He was neither condemned outright nor celebrated officially. His reforms persisted selectively, absorbed where functional, discarded where destabilizing. Legal codes, administrative practices, and military organization remained influential, stripped of personal association. This selective integration reflected maturity born of exhaustion. Europe no longer reacted reflexively. It evaluated. In exile, Napoleon narrated his own past, framing events with characteristic precision. These accounts mattered less for accuracy than for closure. They allowed Europe to relegate him to history, to convert presence into narrative. Once explained, his impact could be managed. Memory replaced immediacy. The resolution of the Napoleonic era did not feel like triumph. It felt like relief. The continent had survived acceleration and learned its limits. Napoleon exited history not as villain destroyed nor hero dethroned, but as a force neutralized through collective restraint. Power withdrew rather than exploded. The system that replaced him prioritized balance over dominance, management over momentum. In this sense, the resolution was not merely Napoleon's end, but Europe's adjustment to what he had revealed. That unchecked speed reshapes everything, and that stability, once broken, must be rebuilt deliberately without spectacle. When Napoleon vanished from active power, Europe did not return to an earlier equilibrium. The absence created space, but what filled it was not restoration of the old world so much as management of a new one that could not be undone. Armies remained large, disciplined, and permanent. States that had once mobilized episodically now maintained standing forces as a condition of survival. The memory of how quickly balance could be overturned lingered in barracks, ministries, and budgets. War had ceased to be an interruption of politics and had become one of its organizing assumptions. The physical traces of Napoleon's era were visible everywhere. Roads cut for military movement stitched regions together more tightly than before. Administrative districts introduced for efficiency persisted because they worked. Legal frameworks standardized under pressure proved useful even without the empire that imposed them. Europe did not keep these systems out of admiration, but out of pragmatism. Removing them would have required effort and uncertainty few were willing to risk. What endured was what had demonstrated function under strain. Militarily, the change was unmistakable. Command structures emphasized coordination, speed, and concentration of force. The lessons learned fighting Napoleon were institutionalized, taught in academies, and refined in peacetime. Officers trained to think operationally rather than locally. Logistics, once secondary, became central. States invested in supply networks, staff planning, and intelligence, aware that future wars would be decided as much by administration as by courage. Napoleon's methods became reference points, not templates, shaping doctrine through reaction as much as imitation. Psychologically, European leadership internalized caution shaped by experience. The fear was not of another Napoleon as individual, but of another disruption that could exploit slowness or division. Coalition politics hardened into habit. No single power was allowed unchecked momentum. Diplomacy became continuous rather than episodic, with congresses and alliances designed to absorb tension before it escalated. This system was imperfect, but it reflected collective memory. The cost of failure was no longer abstract. National identity also shifted under the weight of the era. Resistance to Napoleon had fostered shared language, symbols, and myths that outlasted occupation. In places like Prussia and Spain, reform and nationalism grew from necessity rather than ideology. States reorganized not simply to compete, but to endure. The individual soldier, conscripted and trained in mass, became central to national imagination. Citizenship and obligation intertwined, reshaping the relationship between state and population. Economically, the continent adapted to scale. War had demanded resources, coordination, and production beyond previous norms. Even after peace, governments retained expanded fiscal tools. Taxation systems became more efficient, financial institutions more integrated with state policy. The experience of sustaining prolonged conflict normalized economic intervention. The boundary between civilian life and state requirement narrowed, not dramatically but permanently. Napoleon's personal legacy within this transformation remained contested, yet unavoidable. He was discussed less as man than as catalyst. Memoirs, histories, and debates proliferated, each attempting to locate responsibility and meaning. But regardless of interpretation, his impact was measured by change. Even critics acknowledged that Europe after Napoleon operated differently than before him. The scale of administration, the expectations of command, and the tempo of decision-making had all accelerated. Culturally, the era left a residue of restraint. Grand rhetoric lost some of its credibility after years of mobilization and loss. Romanticism flourished in art and literature, yet governance grew more procedural. The gap between emotional expression and political practice widened. Leaders understood the danger of spectacle unmoored from structure. Stability required dullness as much as vision. For Napoleon himself, legacy was fixed beyond his control. In death, he became symbol, but symbols are shaped by those who use them. Monarchs warned against him, reformers invoked him, soldiers studied him. Each extracted utility. This fragmentation diluted the man into functions, lessons, and cautions. He no longer commanded narrative, he supplied it. The most enduring effect of Napoleon's era was Europe's altered behavior under pressure. States learned to anticipate escalation and to respond collectively. Speed was matched with coordination, ambition with containment. These habits did not prevent future conflict, but they reshaped its form. Wars became industrial, planned, and total in ways foreshadowed by the Napoleonic experience. The continent had been trained by necessity. Borders restored after 1815 shifted again in later decades, yet the systems managing those shifts bore Napoleonic influence. Centralized authority, standardized law, and professional bureaucracy became norms. Even revolutions that opposed imperial legacy often adopted its tools. The contradiction was unresolved but functional. Power structures survived because they addressed modern scale. Napoleon did not invent modern Europe alone, but he forced its acceleration. By compressing time, he revealed vulnerabilities and capacities that could not be ignored. Europe modernized not out of admiration, but in self-defense. The legacy was therefore collective, shaped by reaction as much as action. He dominated Europe briefly, but he trained it permanently. In the quiet after upheaval, this realization settled gradually. Memory replaced immediacy. The continent moved forward carrying the imprint of a man who had once dictated its tempo. His true legacy lay not in the territories he conquered, but in the behaviors he compelled. Europe survived by changing, and that change endured long after his presence faded from the field.